The Echo Chamber, brought to you by the Holmes Report and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.
Welcome to the Echo Chamber. I'm Arthi Shah, your host for today's episode that is focused on the very hot topic of influencer marketing. To speak to this, we have Cathy Planchard on the episode. She is global president of Allison Partners' very fast-growing digital division, All Told. Welcome to the show, Cathy.
Thank you.
All right, so today we're going to tackle a really big topic, and that is influence marketing. And part of it is at Allison Partners, you all have done some extensive research on this topic. Has this been a multi-year?
Yeah, this is about 4 years in now.
Oh, well, yeah. Do you want to give us a quick summary? And of course, for our listeners, I will have links to all of the research that Cathy references in the show notes, so keep a lookout for that. But do you want to give us a quick summary?
Sure. Yeah, so I think we started the influencer research about 4 years ago, and it was really at that point we were trying to understand how people are influenced in a customer journey. So if you're thinking about buying a product or taking a specific action, how are you influenced in each stage, and how does that differ based on vertical market? So for example, if I'm buying moisturizer, that's quite a different type of decision where I get input from than if I'm choosing a new doctor. So the first study was really about the channels of influence and how to reach them. We then followed up with a study which was more about how to identify and score influencers so that you have parameters around them. We looked at the impact of influence in CSR and how both brands and nonprofits could look to influencer. We did some work in Asia Pacific to specifically look at how it's different there. And then most recently we came out with new IP that was much more around the metrics. So what are marketers saying, what are brands saying, and what can we learn from both? So, and I'll add a link to this in the show notes as well, but Cathy, you and I sat down a few months ago at the Innovation Summit in a room with a bunch of folks on the brand side talking about this subject. And one word that came up during that conversation was influencer marketing was described as both the Wild West and swimming in the ocean, which, because compared to traditional media relations, right, yeah. It's just, the rules are ambiguous and inconsistent. So, as we are going further into this realm, are there rules that are emerging? Like, are there some guardrails that brands can use at this point? Or? Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think it's kind of a tipping point right now. So influencer marketing, is really starting to take off. I think it was about $6 billion that was spent in the market last year. But it doesn't have the same type of guardrails, the same type of process or rigor that the other parts of the marketing mix have. So there's a huge amount of divide, I think, between influencers and brands and expectations and reporting. So one of the things that we found out that just honestly kind of was mind-blowing for me was that a lot of time marketers don't even ask about detailed, either a media kit or more detailed information about an influencer's audience. They just kind of look at the content and make a guess about who this is or based on what other brands that influencer represents, and they don't go deeper on that. And that was, you would never buy media that way. You would, of course, look at who you're reaching and the demographics and the lifestyle habits and so forth. But on influencer, it just seems to go in a completely different direction and different rules apply.
So I wonder if that was because initially this was considered to be experimental and the budgets were relatively small, right? And now I think I just saw the news that General Mills is now spending a third of its digital budget on influencer marketing. And I wonder as we start to see the budget's allocation grow, will there be more scrutiny? Are you seeing more processes in place as more money spent?
We're starting to see a lot more on the upfront, I'd say, on the identification piece. There's definitely some emerging platforms that are really trying to simplify processes of engaging, identifying, and contracting. So we're seeing a lot more there. I think one of the big areas that's really lacking, though, is kind of an end-to-end solution that really creates the same type of process that you would apply to other parts of marketing, and then specifically the metrics piece. So a lot of times brands will say, well, was this campaign successful? And they're not always sure what to point back to. And so certainly if you're starting to spend a third of your budget or more, CMOs and the C-suite are all going to be asking, but what are we getting back in exchange for this type of spend?
So what is the answer to that right now?
What is the silver bullet, Cathy?
Let's solve it right here, right now.
And then let's you and I go and sell it.
Exactly.
So there's a couple of things. I think the last study particularly found that there was just a huge gap between kind of the brand and marketers and the influencers themselves. And so everyone knows that they need to be able to show more value, and they're struggling with what it is. And part of it is you have to start with what is the actual objective of the campaign that you're doing, and it could be awareness, it could be sales, it could be something else. And so, you have to first start there, because if it's awareness, then some more of the vanity metrics and things like that actually make a lot more sense. If it's much more about, driving websites or coupon redemptions or whatever it may be, there's a whole different set of metrics around it. But I think, across the board, it's also applying just more process. So, if you want a good ROI, after you start with, what's the business objective I'm trying to achieve, then it becomes, how do you set, consistent expectations? How do you monitor for quality content? One of the other big things we found out is that a lot of times, the marketer is not optimizing the content. So if there's a campaign running, they don't test and optimize it midstream, which again, you would never think to not do that in other parts of the marketing mix. And they're not asking for opinions. And so a lot of times an influencer, the only time he or she will speak up, according to our survey, was if they felt like something was really just off-brand for them personally, but they didn't feel often that they had the ability to interject with their own ideas or opportunities to improve it. They felt like it was more like taking an order from the brand or the marketer, and that their input it was more around execution than it was around creative development.
That was going to be my question, is where is this reluctance coming from? Is it coming from the influencer, or is it coming from the brand? Who feels like they need to cede control? And it sounds like it's coming from the influencer.
I think the influencers feel like they know that they need to show more value. They feel sometimes like it's much more transactional in nature rather than a relationship. And it's interesting, I just saw, there was an article that I just read, actually today, I believe, on Sephora, and they actually just put together what they're calling the Sephora Squad, which was really brilliant. They've got 24 influencers of all different types and sizes, some micro and some very large ones, that are going to have a long-term relationship with them. They're going to weigh in not only on content, but then specifically even on their advertising and things like that, which I think is such a great mix of how to think about influencer. It's they have opinions, they know what works in the space, they know what works in their own feeds, so why not leverage and harness that? And so I think it's up to the influencers to speak up more, but I also think that marketers have to understand that influencer is really relationship based, and so it's not programmatic. It's not as easy as just making a spend and with some banners or otherwise. So I think they have to understand that this is much more relationship based and treated as such.
Seems like an opportunity for public relations, right?
Well, I think so.
So it seems like there's actually a huge opportunity for marketers to sort of set those rules now, right? And to create these relationships that are long-term, that aren't just transactional. And it sounds like with the Sephora example, that more and more companies and brands are waking up to that and realizing that, hey, look, we can dictate a little bit more about how we want this relationship to look.
Yeah, and I think long-term is key. And obviously not all relationships can be that way, but I think, the Sephora example where they've got a group of 24 influencers and it's a long-term relationship, that's going to provide value. And when you think about it from the influencer standpoint, one of the things that came up in the study was if they're paid for, a handful of posts one time for a brand, it literally just starts to look like paid content, advertising content in their feed, right? Because it's one and done, and then it doesn't seem integrated with their other content and their lifestyle, and it just feels like an ad. And so they push back hard on, we can provide more value and more creativity if we have that type of ongoing relationship. And I think a lot of brands, there's other opportunity too of where else can you involve these influencers? Why is it just really, in the online space? Why can't you use them in newsletters, at events, at experiential, and at partner conferences and the like? So I think there's other opportunities to leverage them as well.
And we should clarify, so when we're talking about influencer marketing, are we just talking about the paid relationships, or is there an earned component to this as well?
Yeah, there's actually, it was interesting. In fact, I think at our roundtable a couple months back, I was really surprised at all the different types of influencer programs that everybody talked about. And there's definitely organic and earned. There's no doubt about that. And that should be and always will be at the heart of public relations, And I think that's online and offline. I think right now a lot of people think of influencer as, and oftentimes they think of it as paid, and they think of it as social content. And I think there's such a bigger sphere than that. There's offline influencers, there's organic and paid, and then there's also kind of more like ambassador programs. So we have one client where we run an ambassador program for them, which are people that are very loyal about this product, and it's literally thousands of people that are sharing content about their lifestyle and how it's been impacted by this medical device, and hugely successful, more of an ambassador type of program. So I think there's a lot of different ways to look at it.
So that your point about people think about it as paid and social, like I know whenever I see stuff about influencer marketing, it's usually around Instagram and YouTube. Mm-hmm. So what role do some of these other platforms, like let's stick with social media first and then we'll expand, but what role do some of these other social media platforms play around influencer marketing? Everything from, Facebook, Snapchat, LinkedIn even, Twitter?
Yeah, there's no doubt, I think the market is moving largely and heavily towards Instagram and YouTube, no doubt about it. But, I have, for example, one fashion influencer that I follow, have followed for a long time on Facebook. And it's really interesting that she actually did a poll the other day, and she's kind of she's I think she's probably 30-ish, younger influencer, but very conservative, modest clothes that fit a lot of different types of budgets. And it was interesting, she did a poll of her group, and I mean, she has actually created a community on Facebook, and it's probably about 50,000 women at this point that follow her. And she did a poll that said, where are you guys? Are you on Instagram? Are you on Facebook? And it was shocking how many people preferred Facebook. It was significantly different. And so she's built up, and she is, by every stretch of the imagination, definitely an influencer. She has built up a community of people on Facebook that they know they can go and find that information there from her. And so I do think there's opportunities, and Facebook certainly is moving towards more of a focus on groups. And if you can align groups around special interest, which is what they're doing, it seems like that'll be a natural place for influencer to start to take off again.
So, and it sounds like influencers themselves are learning about their audiences, like in this case. So is there a role that brands can play in that as, to collaborate with the influencer to figure out who exactly is their audience and to make sure that the content's effective, that they're reaching them in the right way, and that it's the right channel even?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think what a lot of influencers have said to us over time is that brands are looking much more at some of the metrics of reach and followers and so forth, and almost formulaic. And they feel like a lot of the value that they provide is actually in the comments and the engagement. And a lot of times that's really hard. It's quite opaque for the marketer because they would literally have to go through, thousands of comments and interactions to understand it. But that's where you can really get to the meat of did someone say something that is a valuable insight about your product or brand or feature that they wish that you had done. So I think the value in the comments and mining that is something that brands and marketers together should figure out a better system of reporting around. And then secondly, when you have all of these likes and comments and all that, it's also very hard for the marketer to understand, did I reach the right people? It's great that you got all these interactions, but were they the right types of people? And were they actually interacting about my product, or were they interacting with the influencer? And those are two very different things. This fashion influencer I was talking about, a lot of people will say, oh, everything you wear looks great on you. Well, that's an interaction, but it didn't really help a product. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done on really mining and finding the insights from the audience that's been reached and the comments and interactions that are happening.
And this seems like a very 2007 question, but
oh no,
are brands comfortable with having comments on? Because I actually have seen some Instagram posts that have been sponsored, and there's no comments. You can like it, but the comments have been disabled. So that made me wonder, is like, are brands going back into this mode of like, we're ceding control, we don't know if we want people having conversations about our brand? And maybe if you're a new brand that doesn't have a lot of baggage, that's fine. But if you're, say, Southwest Airlines, somebody might use this as an opportunity to complain about, their delay or whatever happened to them more recently. So I mean, are you finding that brands are comfortable having comments enabled?
It's a really interesting question. I have not seen brands pushing back on that at this point. It feels like it's kind of counterintuitive to the authentic nature of what this is supposed to be, and it's supposed to be that two-way conversation and dialogue, and that feels much more like just a push strategy where you're placing an ad rather than really leveraging the power of what this could be.
What about B2C versus B2B? A lot of pretty much all the examples we cited, including the General Mills investment, were all on the B2B side. And I'm wondering what you're seeing on the B2C side, and I'm wondering what you're seeing on the B2B side.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think on the B2B side, there's, I think this is where you get to a lot more of the offline influence also. I mean, there's still industry analysts and industry experts, economics, people that do market sizing and the like. I think there's still a lot of opportunity within that space. You asked about channels earlier. We still see a lot of value of publishing on LinkedIn also. We still see that LinkedIn, from a tech and a reaching B2B audiences, can still be quite powerful. And I think it's often, frankly, ignored in terms of marketers and how they think about reaching their targets. So I think that there's opportunity there. I think with B2B, there also, we've seen with some of our clients where they're looking to engage with influencers and then having offline events with them and one-on-one meetings. So it's, again, that mix of online and offline, which I think is interesting. And you're seeing that much more on that side of the fence rather than on the B2C side.
So this point about offline, it makes me think about integration and where influencer marketing should sit across the marketing mix. And yeah, I mean, and how should it integrate and work with other, whether it's offline events, whether it's social media, whether it's even an earned, like, traditional media strategy? Like, where does influencer marketing sit, and how should it touch some of these other points?
So I think, we look at, obviously coming out of a communications agency, we look at influencer marketing very much as relationship based. So we do not approach it like you would a programmatic media buy. We see it as one-to-one relationships with the ability to speak to a type of audience that's specialized or focused in around the influencers, their followers. And so I think the storytelling aspect is still really important. If you get down to it, when you follow an influencer, you're doing it because you like their content, it appeals to you, whether it's the style of the content or the types of things that he or she talks about. And so for me, when you think about, influencer, it really does come back to the storytelling nature. And that's why I think communications professionals are quite good at this, because it's what we do all day long. So I think you have to look at it as relationship based, and I think you have to also look at it as how you tie in the various pieces. So if you're starting a campaign, for example, how do you use influencers to make sure there's no overlap in the message in terms of, if you want to talk about features or you want to talk about benefits or whatever it may be, that you're planning it out and that it's complemented by your shared channels and your own channels. And so I was given the example earlier that a lot of the brands we talk to really just use influencer content in and of itself. They don't amplify it. They don't use those influencers in other ways, whether it be, new product development or at their own, experiential or at their own customer events. And there's so many other opportunities, I think, to tie those pieces together so that it doesn't feel so siloed. And right now, it feels like a lot of times when brands talk to us, there's the marketing and the comms piece, and then influencer is literally a separate RFP, a separate assignment, and it's not really looked at holistically.
Is there a danger of banner blinders with influencer marketing where even an influencer's followers will just ignore and skim right past anything that's a paid or sponsored post and just focus on the organic content?
It's really interesting. There's a lot of studies that say that people are still, they're not turned off by influencer content. They're still seeing it as more authentic, and they're not seeing it as purely like a paid piece. And that may just be education in the market, because this is relatively new. I do think it has to be the right mix for the influencer. And so when we look at identification of influencers, we actually, we have a methodology where we rank and score them based on some IP. But one of the things that we look at is how much of their content is original and organic and how much is paid, because there has to be a blend. If you feel like all you're doing all day long is someone is hawking products at you, you're gonna over time just skim right past it, and I think your banner blinder analogy is right on. I think it's really incumbent on the influencers to make sure that they've got a good mix of paid and authentic and organic content, and I also think that they've got to be super careful about working with brands that are truly a reflection of their own passions and lifestyle choices versus just something that's going to make some additional revenue for them.
So that leads me to my next question about, is there an issue with fake followers, and how do you, how do you counsel brands in terms of really figuring out whether an influencer's followers are legitimate and whether, or is this an issue? Like, I mean, did they pay for a bunch of followers to be able to?
Yeah, it's an ongoing headache, I think, for the platforms, and it's hard for the marketers to understand as well. Instagram did try to do kind of a purge of fake followers, and we're still trying to kind of see the outcomes of that. Some of the technology platforms are trying now to do an assessment. So one of the things that you can do with fake followers is and again, this takes more homework on the side of the agency or the brand, but you have to kind of deeper dive into the comments. And if you see, emojis or single word responses like cute and things like that, a lot of times those can be signs of fake followers. But some of the platforms themselves are now starting to try to find ways to embed into their systems an assessment of fake followers. So one of the platforms, and they are a client, shall I say, Tagger, actually just put together and just released a feature that looks at an assessment of what % of followers they think are fake for an influencer. So I think, and I'm hopeful that technology itself will start to play a better role there.
And then what about, so the term that I often hear is everyone's trying to be the money ball of influencers, right? Like they want to get the more cost-effective influencers early on, or there's an emphasis on, quality over quantity of followers, and sometimes that can mean that can be more cost-effective as well. So how much are you seeing brands just saying, all right, I don't want to make a big splashy investment, but let's identify like tomorrow's influencers. Let's get them early. How much are you seeing that versus the established?
It's hard. I mean, there's influencers popping up every day in every vertical, and in every geography and everything else. And so I think one of the brands that really did a good job of this, as an example, is there's a subscription box. I don't know if you've ever heard of FabFitFun. Do you know that by chance?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a Birchbox. It's a subscription service, and they use micro influencers to basically do unboxings and to show the products. And in the beginning, basically they give the merchandise to those influencers. And then over time, if they've created a certain amount of web traffic or sales or whatever, then they start to actually pay on it. And it's interesting because what it's done from an awareness perspective is just outstanding. And it's also, it seems to be taking over my social feeds right now. So there's a lot of influencers working on this, but they literally deal at any given point in the thousands of influencers that they work with. And so they've taken a very different approach. So I think, and it has been very successful for them. For example, they've got micro-influencers and large-scale influencers. Mm-hmm. And so I think it is a mix. And a lot of it is what's right for the brand. Yeah. Some of the micro-influencers have much more niche audiences, but audiences that are much more aligned with your brand and what you're trying to achieve, and they're more highly engaged. And so we typically do some type of mix and have seen the best results with that.
So that's another question I have, is are there certain sectors where the audience is much more receptive and engaged with influencers than others? Like anecdotally, it seems like beauty seems to be huge. Yeah. I've heard pets, like BarkBox and things like that. Like, are there certain areas where it's so obvious that influencer marketing is the way to go? And are there some sectors where it's a little more untested and it's not clear what the value is?
Yeah, I think, we certainly see it all over the place with beauty, with fashion and retail. Those are two that really stick out. We see it a lot with travel, huge on that. So some of it, I think some of it is some of the more visual type of content, right? So travel is very visual, beauty, fashion, wellness products and the like. We see a lot there. I'm trying to think of food and beverage. Certainly we see a lot there also. And then kind of issues-based. So if there's, products that are more sustainable or vertically based, so really appeal to moms or a certain segment. That's where we're seeing a lot of it. Less so, I'd say, on some of the healthcare pieces. That's a little bit harder to do. And obviously some of the professional services, financial services, all that. That's a little bit more difficult to do as well.
Is influencer marketing dominated by women, or is there a pretty healthy mix?
That is an excellent question. You might have stumped me on that one. I'm just trying to scroll through and think.
Because I was thinking when you mentioned moms, I was thinking about how many posts I see that are targeted that it kind of came from the whole mommy bloggers, right?
Yeah.
That was the thing.
The
proto,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then I thought about men, and I thought, like, are men targeted in the same way by influencers? Like, are there as many male influencers in their, whatever sectors? I mean, if it might be fashion or beauty, it might be something else. Yeah, and I just wondered if they're...
I think from what we just talked about, the fashion and beauty now, it's a little bit more difficult. But I know, like, for example, with a lot of our travel clients, we definitely have an equal mix of male and female. It's a very interesting question. I think some of it comes down to who's making purchase decisions for the brand, and who's going to appeal to them, right?
Yep.
So if it is a mom who's doing the grocery shopping, female influencers to head of households who are making those type of decisions make a lot of sense. So I think it kind of comes from that perspective. I don't know that I've ever seen a breakdown, but it's a really interesting question.
Right, no, and I wonder, like, you think about things like Sonos or like Apple Watch, like some of the electronics, or even like automotive, like if there's a split there. So maybe that's something that we'll explore in a future series. The other question I have is, so speaking of the future, is looking ahead. I mean, so in our conversation a few months ago, somebody had mentioned, I think her name was like Little Michaela, and she was basically a computer-generated avatar, and she had over 1 million followers, right? And she, basically the brand, I don't even know which brand this was affiliated with, to be honest, they decided to create their own influencer and build a whole narrative and story arc for this fake person. Is that the future? Like, do you think that we are a few steps from just brands saying, why don't we just create our own personas?
I hope not.
Yeah, right. But I wonder if there's a generational divide, right? Like I wonder if, and I think this came up in the conversation, was this question of does Gen Z, do they make a distinction as much between someone who's developed and curated by a brand, or like an actual person who's just being, who has a partnership with a brand? Like, are they?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, at the core of influencer, it's supposed to be about, authentic relationships, authentic dialogue. And, avatars obviously are the opposite of that. Avatars and carefully curated and placed content. That said, I am fascinated by, Gen Z, and because they did grow up around influencers and YouTube stars and the like. So I'm very interested to see if there is a banner blinder kind of phenomenon. I think it may happen with that generation, because it's almost like they can sniff it out because they grew up around it, So I think that'll be very, very interesting. But for me, it still gets down to, I'm not going to click through and make a purchase decision or change a behavior or action based on content that I know is inauthentic. And so I think I still think that becomes the litmus test for the future.
Yep. I mean, I think we buy from who we identify with, and who we trust, right?
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Anything else that we haven't touched on about influencer marketing that you think is worth noting?
I think it's really the metric side, and we talked a little bit about setting the objectives up front. I think the other piece is, there are some opportunities, I think, to really increase and improve how we report on results on the influencer side. And so there's everything from, setting more measurable, links and offers, whether it's coupons or whatever it may be, to things like correlation statistics. And so correlation statistics literally looks at, did this one thing, so for example, did this influencer program result in a lift in sales or a lift in website traffic or whatever it may be? I think using some of the technology and some more modeling around metrics is important, and I think there's a real opportunity for brands to explore more in that area. Excuse me.
The digital, like the coupons and the codes, to me that seems so, like, that just seems like an obvious way to like track to see whether.
It does, but I think there's also like pixel tracking that you can do in content. I think there's more testing and optimization that brands can be doing so that they're learning from past. And I also think that, frankly, the industry, we talked about the wild, wild west and swimming in the ocean. We need better benchmarks. It's very difficult to say whether a campaign was successful relative to other campaigns in the industry. So, in direct marketing, you know what open rates are, you know what, cold calling could result in. There's standard industry benchmarks. We don't have that for influencer marketing. So I think that's a critically important part. And that then will actually lead to an opportunity to better regulate what payments should be. Because right now, it's really, it is a little wild, wild west with payments in terms of what the influencer can request and what the marketer feels is the value of that.
So who owns the data then? So if Instagram, so say it's on Instagram and you partner with an influencer, does the brand have to ask the influencer for metrics, or like how does that relationship work?
Yeah, that's all part about the kind of the process, and so that should be set up front as part of the performance expectations, and it should be in the contract. And so, you should literally be doing a creative brief with all of the expectations. What do they need to understand about the tone of the brand messaging that's important, do's and don'ts, if you will, imagery, not handing someone the imagery, but at least some parameters or guidelines around. All those types of things need to be sold up front, and getting the audience insights and metrics should be written in every contract.
Wow, this is such a big topic, and even in the few months since we talked about it in February to now in May, it feels like it's changed. Yeah.
So every day.
Yeah. And but I will say, and I think it came up in the conversation we had in February, this is coming up in pretty much every conversation I'm having, whether it's someone on the agency side or someone on the brand side, is figuring out influencer marketing. So we will be revisiting this topic again, and I'm sure when you all have your next iteration of research, we should probably have you back on here again.
I would be happy to.
All right, well, great chatting with you, Cathy.
Thank you so much.
And that concludes another episode of The Echo Chamber. Thank you to our guest, Cathy Planchard, and thank you to our producers, marketeers, and we will be back soon with another episode.
You've been listening to The Echo Chamber, brought to you by the Holmes Report and produced by the international broadcast specialist marketeers.